presentation is being recorded, and if you do not wish to participate in a recorded webinar, please disconnect yourself at this time. Now, this presentation is a courtesy service to our clients and our dear friends. It is designed to only give you general information on the developments actually covered. It is not intended to be a comprehensive summary of recent developments in the law, treat exhaustively the subjects covered, provide legal advice, or render a legal opinion. Now, a little bit about Sam. Sam Wolkenhauer is the Idaho Department of Labor's economist for Northern Idaho. In addition to serving the northern counties with economic insight, he also manages several forecasting programs for the state of Idaho, producing projections of the state's demographics and labor market. And before joining the Department of Labor, he earned his degree in mathematics and economics from Eastern Washington University. He's a beautiful wife and baby girl, and one of my favorite fun facts about Sam, unless I've been told incorrectly, is that he used to crunch numbers for the NFL. So Sam, I'd love to know who's winning the Super Bowl this year.
It wasn't for the NFL, it was for sports betting, but I think the Bills look pretty strong, sadly.
All right. All right, well, we'll hold out for Buffalo this year then. All right, Sam, you do have the ability to share your screen. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sam for today's presentation. Sam, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to try to do in the next hour is give a holistic overview of a lot of really important developments that are happening in the economy. And without running too far ahead, what you're going to see as we move through here is that 2022 is shaping up to be a major inflection point. And more broadly, we're going to eventually come to think of the economy, the way business is done, the way the economy functions. We're really going to think of 2020 to 2024, this period that we're in right now, as this crossover point. And there's going to be a really clear before and after. And I'm going to tell you exactly how that's emerging and where it's headed. So we're going to cover a few different topics here. We're going to talk about inflation, labor supply, and demographics. Demographics are a really big one because there's a demographic transition that's happening not just here in the United States, but globally, that underpins a lot of this. And so the broad overview is that the economy is changing in major ways globally, and this is creating challenges here in America in terms of inflation and labor supply, but it's also very exciting, and we think that the United States is really poised to come out of this very strongly, in a much better position than a lot of other major economies. And so there's always that tension between opportunity and sort of the travails of going through a transition. So let's just jump right into this and talk about inflation. Inflation has been rising very quickly. It crested 9% here in quarter two. So this is the highest inflation rate that we've had since the 70s. So what I'm showing you here is year over year consumer price index growth, which is just our broad benchmark of prices in the economy. So 9% year over year is kind of like a broad average. Now, what we want to note about this is that the consumer price index is not a cost of living index. Okay, so there are certain categories where prices really are not up so significantly. Televisions, just taking a random example, are pretty flat. But of course, you don't buy televisions with the same frequency that you buy gasoline. Most likely, if you do, you have some sort of very interesting lifestyle. So there are those high frequency, very important purchases, food and energy specifically, and those prices are up more than 9%. You know, there are food categories where prices are up 30% year over year. Pork, for example. We're actually going to talk about pork later, so stand by, all you bacon fans. So we know that this is not a cost of living index. This is just a broad measurement of prices in the economy. So the obvious question that arises then is, what's driving inflation? And this is a very complicated issue, but we can boil it down to a pretty basic problem. And the problem, the reason we have inflation is that there is a lot of money in the US economy right now. There's a great deal of liquidity. Okay, and this is partially due to some of the programs that were adopted during COVID. So we had stimulus bills, we had those stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits. The Federal Reserve was pumping money into the banking system to try to prevent a financial collapse. So there was a lot of extra liquidity getting pumped into the economy, actually about $5 trillion. So compared to before COVID, there's about $5 trillion more dollars circulating, just kind of sloshing around the economy, looking for things to buy. Interest rates have been low for a long time. People were saving a lot of money in 2020. They weren't going on vacation. They put off buying cars, major purchases. So there's a lot of money, but there's a limited ability to produce product. So there's raw material shortages. There's problems with labor, with transportation. So there is a disconnect in the economy right now between the amount of liquidity, the amount of product, and that drives prices up. It actually boils down in the end to a very simple supply and demand sort of imbalance. The question then becomes, how do we resolve that supply and demand imbalance? And we're going to look at how that might resolve itself down the road. And you can see this if we throw in this other measurement of inflation that we have. So the blue line is that CPI, the consumer index. The red is the producer index. So in essence, cars, bread, and clothing go in the consumer index. Aluminum, wheat, and cotton go in the producer index, right? That's the raw materials. And you can see that the raw material side is up very significantly. So this would be commodities. So let's think a little bit about what's going on here. Raw materials are globally traded. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is a major breakdown in the efficient global trade of these commodities. So the most obvious culprits would be COVID, disrupting global shipping, particularly in China. China has really badly bungled its COVID policy, locking down their ports for extended periods of time. We also have war in Eastern Europe that is disrupting the flow of gas to Europe. So European energy prices are up literally 30 times over what they are normally. But there are other problems going on behind the scenes. And there's one example that I wanted to bring up because I think that this really illustrates just how complicated and fragile global supply is. Okay. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of transportation, raw materials, and trade that is responsible for making the modern economy function. And a lot of that is starting to break down. So the example that I want to use is I would like to talk about Chinese food, okay, and not the food you get in a restaurant, of which there is diverse flavor profiles on offer. I want to talk about how the People's Republic of China feeds 1.3 billion people. Okay, that's a lot of people, and feeding them is difficult. And in China, most of the calories come from two sources. Okay, the primary cereal grain is rice. That makes up about 2/3 of carbohydrates. And the primary protein is pork. Okay, China is pork crazy. They consume by far the most pork per capita. And then when you add in that there's 1.3 billion of them, almost 2/3 of all the pork eaten in the world is eaten in China. Okay, and China's having problems with both aspects of this food supply. So obviously there's a lot to Chinese cuisine, but day to day, what keeps the Chinese people going is pork protein and rice. Okay, those are their most important foodstuffs. China's having problems with their pork supply. They have had massive outbreaks of African swine flu, which thankfully is not one of those swine flus that can jump to people, but it can devastate pork herds. A couple years ago, they had to do a massive culling of their hog herds. The number of hogs that were culled in China was larger than the number of hogs in the rest of the world combined. Okay, so they're having issues with their pork supply. And if you're the Chinese government, you're worried about that for obvious reasons, because it makes up 2/3 of the meat that's eaten in the country. So China then becomes worried about rice. They need to have a good rice harvest or people might starve. Well, there's an issue with Chinese rice as well. Chinese rice, Chinese soil is very poor. China has some of the poorest soil quality of any major country, which is why it uses the most fertilizer of any industrialized country. And rice in particular relies on a lot of phosphate fertilizer. There's two major categories of fertilizer, nitrogen and phosphates. Rice is a very phosphate heavy crop. So to make sure that they can grow rice effectively, China naturally became the world's leading producer of phosphates. Okay. Well, in the last year, their pork supply has dwindled. They're worried about food security. So China has done two very interesting things. First, they banned the export of phosphates. They're the world's largest exporter of phosphates. That's a very important fertilizer. When the world's largest producer of that fertilizer bans the export because they're worried about growing enough rice for themselves, the price of phosphates triples. And right now, the price of phosphates here in America is triple what it was a couple of years ago. The other thing they've done to try to supplement and cover for all those hogs they had to cull, they started to import a lot of pork. That is why bacon and other pork products are about 40% more expensive than they were last year. And these are the kind of things that we don't think about. To us, this happens completely behind the scenes. Do we really think that the phosphate intensity and the soil quality in China and swine fever, is that really that important to us? Well, it is directly linked to higher bread prices, higher produce prices, because right now fertilizer is very expensive. It's very expensive for farmers. It's directly linked to higher pork prices because China's trying to buy as much of the pork as they can to offset what they had to cull out of their herds. This is just one example, and there are many examples that I could bring up. Neon for semiconductors in Ukraine, natural gas, of course. There's a very complicated global trading system, and behind the scenes, that is responsible for modern quality of life. And that system is breaking down in a lot of ways. And this is provoking an economic transition and higher prices. Okay, so right now, the interesting thing is that with these higher prices, American consumers so far are just kind of biting the bullet and paying those higher prices. So this is consumer retail sales. And what I did was I adjusted it for the inflation level. So what you can see is that even at these higher prices, Americans so far are buying the same amount of stuff. Okay, so this is what we would call real sales, meaning it's adjusted for the price level. It reflects real underlying consumption. And so far, because the American consumer has really been fairly flush with cash for the past couple of years, thanks to stimulus bills and savings in 2020, they're really just paying the higher prices so far. And until they stop being willing to pay these higher prices, inflation will continue to go up because that supply and demand imbalance remains. So when you have an imbalance like this that's driving inflation, there are two ways that prices can come back down, can stabilize. You can either get rid of demand, meaning people are spending less, the economy slows down, potentially that's a recession, or you can get supply back up. And unfortunately, there does not seem to be any near-term prospect for the global economy and trading system getting back to normal. So the only way that inflation is going to come down is if we achieve what we colloquially call demand destruction. But really that just means we make things so expensive that people can't afford to buy them anymore. Okay, so inflation will eventually become self-limiting because prices will just be too high for people's stomach. But that hasn't happened yet, and that's why it just continues to rage up at that 9% level. So we have all of this going on, and the response to this has been to raise interest rates. The Federal Reserve continually raises interest rates. They're very worried about inflation, and they have explicitly said that they are willing to tolerate a recession if that's what it takes to get inflation under control. And so they're continually raising interest rates in that regard. Benchmark interest rates for mortgages are already over 7%. and they're probably going to go up a few more percentage points by early next year. Okay, so the problem is that the American consumer is just, he's just too strong. He just keeps buying. And so the beatings will continue until morale improves. That's kind of the situation we're in with the central bank. Only in this case, it's the rate hikes will continue until demand destruction kicks in. So there's a lot of things going on right now. A lot of threats to the economy. So we'll run down these. Inflation is the obvious one. People are going to get priced out of purchases, and that's going to slow down economic activity, and it's going to lower standard of living, right? We also have rising interest rates. Median home prices declined last month for the first time in who knows how long. We've had this outrageous bull housing market for years, and last month there started to show some cracks. Okay, rising interest rates have really reduced home affordability. The other problem right now is that the market is kind of stuck. Okay, nobody really wants to buy right now because there's this sense that the market is about to turn down, right? There's a sort of broad feeling among home buyers that the market is at its top right now, and you don't want to be the guy that buys at the top. So demand is really starting to crack for housing. We also have a slowdown in the Chinese economy. This is partially due to some demographic things that I'll talk about later, but a lot of this is because they've mismanaged their COVID policy. China will shut down a major port of 5 million people over a fairly small outbreak of cases. And I know that there's a wide variety of opinions on COVID, but almost everybody can agree that the Chinese are radically overzealous, and it's really starting to hurt their economy. So China's economy is really starting to grind from their COVID lockdowns. We also have major economic threats in Europe. We'll be blunt. We love our European friends, but Europe has been subsidized for the last 2 decades with cheap Russian energy. That's what keeps their manufacturing competitive. European labor is very expensive, right? And so the thing that has kept European manufacturing cost competitive was cheap energy. And now their energy is the most expensive in the world. There are already examples of major German manufacturers looking to relocate their operations to the United States to escape crushing energy costs, because America, it's a wonderful place for many reasons. One is that we have an indigenous energy supply. We make electricity, oil, and natural gas here, and it's very cheap. Right now, our natural gas is a fraction of European costs. So there's major economic drag from Europe. We're going to be somewhat insulated from that, but that's, a major drag on global growth. And then this last one, this was exciting for me. I got to put a fresh bullet point on here this morning. The British financial system is melting down as we speak. The pound has reached all-time lows against the dollar. I remember when I was younger and I was an economics student, kind of the rule of thumb that I'd remembered was that the pound was usually worth roughly $1.50. Now it's $1.02. Okay, so the pound has devalued massively. And this morning, the Bank of England was unable to successfully auction off new government debt. Okay, so nobody wants Britain's debt, which means they had to radically raise the interest rate to try to convince people to buy it. So this is a pretty classic scenario that you see in developing markets. This wouldn't be uncommon maybe for Brazil. This is not what you expect to see in Britain. So normally you see this from an emerging market, but when it happens to Britain, you have to question whether they're becoming a submerging market. So basically everybody's having problems of their own. The Russians are mired in a war. The Chinese are slowing down their economy with bungled COVID policy. Europe and Britain are facing massive economic dislocation. It wouldn't be surprising to see unemployment of 30% in Germany by the end of the winter. So it makes it weird that here in America, we just kind of continue creating jobs and chugging along and doing our own thing. So let's talk about that. Why does America have so much insulation from this? And there's a lot of things going on here, okay? America has many things going for it. We have cheap energy. Our demographics are actually fairly good, as we'll see in a little bit. And the dollar has become unbelievably valuable in recent months. The dollar is at all-time highs against the yen, against the euro, against the pound, any currency you want to think of. So America has kind of become this little refuge of economic solidity in a very, very choppy global market. So this is America's jobs count. This is our non-farm jobs. So you can see that red line there. That would be COVID. That's not supposed to happen. We don't normally like to see 25 million jobs destroyed in 1 month. That's a situation that I would characterize as less than ideal. But we bounced pretty hard off the bottom there. We got a lot of those jobs back in the following months. And then over the last year and a half, we've just kind of steadily churned up. And there doesn't seem to be any cracking in the American labor market. It's a very solid rate of job creation. And in fact, the problem we're having at this point is that it's becoming increasingly hard to fill these jobs. And so while other countries are facing elevated unemployment, unemployment in Europe is going to be very high in a very short period of time. Here in America, we have the reverse problem. We can't fill all the jobs that we need to fill. So we can look at this by just looking at the gap between the number of job openings and the number of unemployed people. Okay, so the red line is unemployed people. That's supply of workers, right? And the blue line is job openings. You can see from 2016 to early 2020, this was a labor market that was pretty close to equilibrium. The number of workers was pretty close to the number of open jobs. Then COVID breaks the whole thing wide open. So we got a functioning market there for a little while. COVID really splits it apart. But then in early 2020, these lines cross over and now they're going opposite directions. And we enter this condition of labor shortage. So right now there are twice as many open jobs in this country as there are unemployed people, okay? And so this is, by definition, a labor shortage. So this is kind of weird. Europe is facing, a winter of mass unemployment, skyrocketing energy prices. In America, we have inflation, but our job creation is so strong. And what a lot of this reflects is economic turmoil in the rest of the world and economic activity trying to bail out to America, right? You have manufacturers in Europe trying to shift their operations here. You have America trying to boost its energy output to really keep Europeans from freezing, right? So we're trying to process more natural gas so we can ship it to Europe. So America has kind of become the economic reservoir, especially for Europe, but for some other countries like Japan and South Korea as well. And so I would much rather have a problem of a labor shortage than mass unemployment, right? It's better to have too many jobs than too few, but this does create its own friction and its own issues. So we'll work through this and talk about what's going on. And the question is, what's wrong with the labor supply? Why don't we have enough workers? We've traditionally, for most of the last century, had a labor market that we can fill most of the jobs. So this condition of a really tight labor market with massive shortfalls is rather new for us. So let's talk about what's going on here. Okay, number one, we have to acknowledge that America has had low population growth for the last couple of decades. Okay? And the demographics are very important. In many ways, they're the most important thing. Everybody wants to talk about interest rates and monetary policy and fiscal policy and this and that, but for the most part, the trajectory of an economy is determined by geography and demographics, right? What's in the ground? What can you make out of it? And do you have people to do that? Okay. So we've had low population growth. And so when you are trying to tinker with these other things, education and things like that, you're really trying to make the most out of your human resources. And if the demographics are bad, all you're really doing is trying to make the most out of a bad situation. And that is indeed what most countries are attempting to do right now. All right, next we have skill level mismatch. This is one of those sanitized terms that we come up with to make ourselves feel better. Really what this means is that when unemployment is down to 3%, it's even lower than that in Idaho, it's like 2.5%. A lot of the people that are unemployed are simply not employable. They have issues maybe with criminality or substance abuse. You may have heard this term soft skills. That's another one of those sanitized expressions, because soft skills basically just means, can you show up on time for your interview, not lie, and then not steal on the way out? And so that's ethics, right? But it sounds bad to say that people don't have ethics. So we call it soft skills, and then we feel better about it because then we've turned it into a technocratic educational issue rather than some sort of sociobiological ethical crisis. That just sounds worse. Okay, so we sanitize it. Skill level mismatch. Okay, we have had issues with retirements. We're just kind of going to shelve that for the moment. We're going to come back to that when we move on to demographics in a moment. Disabilities of despair is a bulk category. There are 3 things that go into this: alcohol abuse, prescription or illegal drug abuse, and then depression and suicidality. So collectively, these 3 things are the largest cause of death for males 25 to 55 in this country. So we realize this is a public health crisis. It's an ethical crisis, a criminal justice issue, but it is also an economic issue because it actually does keep millions of predominantly males from living productive lives and having careers and contributing to the labor force. So without downplaying the other aspects of this, it is an issue for our economy as well. Okay. And then finally, we have childcare availability. We know that the cost and availability of childcare keeps a lot of people, predominantly mothers, roughly 90% of stay-at-home parents are mothers, from working. And childcare is a notoriously difficult problem to solve because it's a very difficult industry to staff properly. And the reason for that is most people that want to work with children, that are attracted to working with children, they prefer to work in the school districts, okay? Because daycare work is essentially minimum wage work, right? And to be honest, it's a fairly high intensity, potentially high on the gross factor for minimum wage work. So in the school district, the kids are hopefully potty trained, the pay is better, the benefits are way better, you get summers off. So it's not hard to see why the people that want to work with kids are usually not drawn to a long career in daycare settings. And in fact, a lot of daycare settings tend to be young people who are working on teaching certificates and then they leave after they get them. So it's really hard from a labor side to provide adequate childcare, and that has a multiplier effect by forcing a lot of people to stay home when they would prefer to have a dual income household. Okay, so we got all these things going on, educational issues and substance abuse and childcare, and we realize that these matter, but they matter largely at the margin because ultimately what this is all about is trying to maximize the demographics. And the demographics simply are not good. So let us transition to this next point and talk about demographics. And what we're going to see is that a lot of the transitioning and a lot of the changes that are happening in the economy are happening because of demographic changeover. So I would like to start with probably not the country you're expecting. I'd like to start with Nigeria. And the reason I want to start with Nigeria is because Nigeria illustrates what human demographics have looked like for 99% of human history. Okay, this is what every country, every society looked like until 1900, more or less. So this is a non-industrial economy where most people work on farms in manual labor type settings. So the average Nigerian family has almost 6 children. Okay? So you end up with a lot of kids, and this creates this structure. This is what we call a population pyramid. This is a standard way to show demographics. You have male and female on opposite sides. And then each bar is 5 years worth of population. So the bottom bar is the 0 to 5-year-olds, then up to the 10-year-olds, and so on and so forth. And we call it a population pyramid because at one point they all actually looked like pyramids. So Nigeria actually still has a pyramid because they have 6 children apiece. So you end up with a lot of children. Life expectancy is not so long. So unfortunately, the population tapers. Not everybody reaches middle age, and even fewer reach seniority. So you end up with this tapered structure. The average Nigerian right now is a little under 17 years old. So it's a very, very young population. And everybody looked like this up to a point. So having this in mind, this is the base, the starting point for a country's demographics. Let's look at some other countries. Let's start by looking at China. Okay, China had a real pyramid going on until about 50 years ago. And it was terrifying to their government because they saw a population that was growing, unbounded and would eventually eat the world, and they would not be able to feed people. So China, about 30 years ago, adopted what we all know as the one-child policy. And the way we know it was 30 years ago is because if you look at China's demographics, look at the drop in the population from the 30-year-old bar to the 25 bar. Okay. 30 years ago, China adopts the one-child policy. Today, China is running out of 30-year-olds. Now, why does this matter? Well, we like to think of China as a country that has unlimited cheap labor. China can make everything, and as much as we are sometimes worried about the dominance of Chinese manufacturing, we also enjoy it because Chinese manufacturing made a lot of things very cheap for us over the last 30 years. But China, as the source of unlimited labor, is a thing of the past. China's population probably reached its high point about 5 years ago, and it's going to start shrinking very quickly because of their horribly imbalanced demographics. Right now, there are 1.3 billion Chinese. The median forecast is that by the end of the century, there will be 500 million of them. Okay, we're talking about a country that's going to shrink by more than half by the end of the century. What implication does that have for us? Well, it means that China, as this source of unlimited cheap manufacturing, is just not the reality anymore. Product from China has become more expensive. A lot of manufacturers have actually worked really hard to pull their operations out of China in the last decade as labor costs became more and more expensive there. China itself is frenetically frenzied trying to roboticize their manufacturing to keep it going because they see the demographic drop off coming very soon. So China is not a source of unlimited manufacturing anymore, and their economy is going through a major transition point. And this, again, what we talked about, this is a transition point. China and the way it interacts with the global economy is changing. Trade flows with China are reaching new lows with every passing month. And so we need to become adjusted to this changing world where demographics really limit the amount of production that is possible. Let's look at some other Asian countries. We will see that this trend is really ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Okay, so this graph combines 4 countries: Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. And when you add those countries together, you get most of our trade with the non-Chinese Asian economies. Okay, so these are all major trading partners. And what you notice is the bulk of the population is in its late 40s, early 50s. Okay, this is also an aging population. These countries collectively are going to decline significantly. There are 130 million Japanese right now. There might be 80 million by the end of the century. Okay, it's a rapidly aging country. South Korea is actually aging even faster than Japan. South Korea's population will probably be half of what it is now by the end of the century. And this matters because we trade with these countries. They are major economic partners. South Korea and Japan are the the source of a lot of manufactured goods that we enjoy. Automobiles, of course, come to mind, but also a lot of electronics. Thailand and Vietnam do a lot of assembly work for American manufacturers. And these are countries where the workforce is shrinking. The population is past its peak and will be shrinking through the rest of the century. And so labor availability just becomes very, very limited. Okay. And this has serious implications because this makes everything more expensive. Essentially, what we're seeing as we move through is this pattern where countries are aging, they're getting old, their workforce is shrinking, and that makes producing things there more expensive, which means less availability and higher costs for American consumers. Okay. The other thing it means is that people will try to move their manufacturing back to America or close to America, Mexico, for example, because they're trying to find labor. You don't want to be stuck in what is essentially a dying population with major manufacturing resources. So this is the transition that we're talking about, and it's all being driven by this demographic changeover. Hey, let's look at Europe. Okay, Europe has lots of problems. One of their biggest problems is that they are missing the most important American resource, which is millennials. Okay, so millennials were born in the late 80s and the 90s, and there are a lot of us, okay? And that makes us important. But if we look at this, if we look at Europe's population, okay, late 80s, early 90s, so those people would be roughly 30, early 30s. Well, what we see here is that Europe's population drops off significantly around the year 30. So right as the millennials were being born, lots of us were the biggest generation in America, Europe had a massive crash in its birth rate. Okay, so this creates very important implications. For the past 20 years or so, Europe has been a country or a continent full of 50-year-old engineers. Okay? Germany especially, Germany's the oldest country in Europe, also the largest economy and most important manufacturer. Germany's a country of 50-year-old engineers. You can design and build a lot of really nice BMWs, nice Bosch dishwashers, but at a certain point, those 50-year-old engineers become 65-year-old engineers and they retire. And the European workforce begins to shrink. And that is what has happened. Europe is also well into its shrinking phase. And the basic issue here is that if you compare the 60-year-old bar to the 15-year-old bar, there's a gap of about 4 million on either side. So there just are not enough young people coming in to replace the retirees. So their economy is shrinking, their labor availability is shrinking, and their ability to make things is shrinking. And so I used to quip that the last German working at the BMW plant would have to get the lights, okay? And now their energy is so expensive that the lights will already be off, but the demographics are still extremely problematic. I read one one economist who I thought this was, a pretty stunning way to put it. Germany's manufacturing was not going to survive the decade, and this energy crisis simply means that it won't survive the year. Okay, so these were economies that had a major shelf life built in because of the demographics. All right, let's come a little closer to home. Let's look at Mexico. Mexico's interesting because this isn't a pyramid. It's not quite a pyramid, but you can see that it looks something like a pyramid. And actually, it is a perfect pyramid from about the age 30, 25 and up, okay? But then it begins to taper, and so we end up with a shape that looks kind of like one of those Russian onion domes. Okay, so what happened to Mexico? They had a pyramid until about 1990. So then we start to think this is a nice little mystery. What happened to Mexico starting right around 1990? And then it hits us because we're smart. NAFTA was implemented in the 1990s. So pre-1990, Mexico was an agricultural society. People lived on farms. They had 4 kids apiece because on a farm, kids are labor. Kids are actually very useful on a farm. They're not so useful in an urban setting where you have to get them to school and think about maybe paying for their college. Those pesky child labor laws prevent them from being productive. So Mexican families used to have almost 5 kids apiece in 1980, and then it drops off significantly. So what happened? Mexico industrialized thanks to NAFTA. A lot of manufacturing was set up in Mexico. This is manufacturing that supports American manufacturing. It tends to be the lower value add, lower wage work. So we keep a lot of the design and engineering work here in our country, and the lower value add stuff goes to Mexico. And in about 20 years, Mexico transitions from being a poor farming country to a middle income manufacturing country. So Mexico is not a third world nation. Mexico is highly urbanized at this point. There's a lot of manufacturing work. And when that happened, the birth rate dropped from 5 to about 2. So Mexico is not running out of Mexicans. They are running out of Chinese. They're running out of Japanese. Mexico isn't running out of people, but they're stable. They're not really going to grow very quickly at this point. At 2.1, that is population stability. Okay, why is that important? Well, for most of the late 1900s, Mexico was our largest source of immigrants. And the reason it was the largest source of immigrants is because of that birth rate. Let's think about what it would be like to be a Mexican farming family in 1980. Okay, you have your farm, you have 5 kids because that's the average, 3 boys. We're just spitballing here. You don't have the land to chop up your farm and give all 3 of your sons their own farm as an inheritance. Okay. And there isn't a whole lot of work in the cities because the country hasn't industrialized yet. Where does the extra son go? He goes to America to work, right? It was an agricultural society with a high birth rate that didn't have enough farmland to keep splitting off farms for each new generation. So every generation would send a lot of its young men and a lot of its young families to America to work. Immigration to the United States from Mexico was very, very high until the early 2000s. And then it began to crater off. And it's actually been negative for most of the last decade. So almost all of the immigration that comes across the southern border is not Mexican citizens. They're people from Central American countries predominantly. Mexico's population has stabilized and its economy is stabilized to the point where they are no longer providing immigration labor to the United States. So when Mexico was still a farming country, it was a demographic backstop for America. There was a steady flow of essentially Mexican third sons, right? The son that there isn't enough farm for, who would come to America to work. But once it becomes an urbanized, industrialized economy, he doesn't need to go to America to provide for himself. He goes to the city and he gets a nice middle income job at a factory. And that's how an industrialized country works. And that's what Mexico is now. And so that's great for them. Their incomes are higher. They aren't losing people across their northern border. But it has limited the flow of labor to the United States from Mexico, and that it's been very low and actually negative in some years. More Mexican citizens moving back home than immigrating here. All right, finally, we get to the main show. And after looking at all these other countries, at Europe, at China, suddenly we realize our demographics are actually pretty okay because we have millennials, and there's so many of us, okay? So the baby boomers in America did one thing that none of the other boomer generations around the world did. The German boomers didn't do it. The Japanese boomers didn't do it. The American baby boomers replaced themselves. They hit that over 2 children per family mark. And so we have 71 million baby boomers. And that was the largest generation in history for quite a while. Gen X kind of snuggled in there. Nobody ever talks about poor Gen X. There's only 66 million of them, you know, so they're not as many. And with the age they are right now, Gen X isn't retiring. They're not going to school. They're just kind of, it's middle child syndrome. They're so well behaved that nobody pays attention to them. So I am sorry to anyone Gen X that's listening. But then, oh, the millennials, so many of them, 72 million. So this creates an interesting structure. You have 2 big generations. two generations over 70 million. After the millennials, we have Gen Z. There's not quite as many of them. And frankly, Gen Z has some interesting issues. The mental health statistics are very alarming. So I'm not really sure how much we're going to get out of them. But the gap of these generations is very interesting. You got two big generations, boomers and millennials, two big bulges in the curve. The gap between them is important because it means that you have a limited period of time where the workforce is double dipping on these two generations. In fact, that period of double dipping was roughly from 2010 to 2020. That was the decade where the bulk of both big generations were in the labor force at the same time. So it's a Goldilocks zone. It's this brief interregnum where you're double dipping on the parent and child big generations, but eventually the Goldilocks zone closes and we start to lose our boomers on the top end. And this is the demographic transition that America is going through. And this is why we have a labor shortage. Those other things matter, childcare availability and education. Of course, those are important, but at the end of the day, the demographics determine everything. So this leads to kind of the money shot here, which I affectionately have titled the death cross. And I titled it that because I want people to pay attention to it. It doesn't actually have anything to do with death yet, because hopefully you don't die at 65. You just suffer economic death, labor force death, right? The end of your productive years. So I had this solution that I floated that nobody's interested in. My idea was we just raid all the pensions, crash the stock market, and crash the housing market, and then the boomers won't have any money and they'll have to work forever. But nobody is interested in that, so they get to retire. And ultimately, the demographics boil down to a very simple question. How many people are going to turn 65 and how many people are going to turn 18 this year? How many people age in and out of the labor force? Well, look from 2012 to 2020, huge positive inflow. A lot of people turning 18, aging into the workforce, that would be the millennials. But the boomer retirement is just starting to ramp up. But as more and more boomers cross that magical 65-year-old threshold, these lines converge and flip, and now the ratio is inverted. And I want to draw your attention to what year the crossover happens. The lines intersect in 2022. Okay. We're having a labor shortage right now because this was always going to be the year that our working age population began its reversal. Okay. And when this is the case, all we're doing is trying to make the best of a bad demographic situation. Now, I would like to preface this by pointing out all these other countries, the Japans and Germanys of the world, they crossed over this point a long time ago, and it's very sharply negative. So all things considered, grading on a curve, this is okay, but it's still unpleasant and it creates a lot of friction in the labor market and it creates labor shortages. It drives wages up and all of those problems that I know human resource professionals, of course, are specifically aware of. So let's just look at this on a decade by decade basis. Right, here is the growth of the working age population by decade. I mean, 80s through the 2000s, it's really easy for the economy to grow. Stuff is abundant, labor is abundant. This is a nice, clearing, functional economy. The labor force pool, the working age population is growing by 2 million a year in some cases. But then the 2020s was always going to be the decade where this bar turned red, flips over to the other side of the axis. And when this is the case, you're just in for a rough ride on the labor side. Okay? There's really no way around it. So the best news is that it gets worse. Wait, no, I don't think that's good news. Anyway, so if we look at the youth population, this is the population of under 18s by single year. what you notice is that there's more high schoolers than there are kids in the elementary ages. And once you get down under 10, and especially under 5, the number of children being born just continues to taper off. Okay, so we can think of this like a conveyor belt. And I know, because I have a 1-year-old, and it's super easy to look at a 1-year-old and go, this is not an economically productive person. In fact, this is a labor sink, because I have to do so much more labor around the house just to maintain some like stasis level of cleanliness. So this isn't an economically productive population, but 18 years from now, hopefully they will be. It's a conveyor belt. Every year, the new batch of 18-year-olds gets dropped into the labor force, and that's our reinforcement on the labor side, right? And so we can look down this conveyor belt, and essentially what we see is that there's a smaller and smaller batch coming down the line, which means there's really no reason to expect a major reversal on the labor side. It's just not in the demographics. So all we can do is try to squeeze more labor force participation out of the population that we have. All right, let's try to recap this, and then I think we have a little time for Q&A. So the global economy is going through a demographic transition. It's breaking down trade flows. Economies are really grinding right now. But America is having the opposite problem. We're not struggling with mass unemployment, we're struggling with a labor shortage. And what this reflects is that we have different problems than anyone else. Our energy is pretty cheap. The dollar is very strong. Our demographics are not ideal, but they're actually better than everybody else's. You could be, we're not looking at half of our population dying in the next 50 years, thank God. So America overall is doing much better. You got a lot of manufacturing growth, industry trying to move back here, and this is stressing the economy. So this is pretty classically a recipe for high prices, similar to the high inflation that we had in the 60s and 70s. Rapid economic growth, lots of job creation, but we're doing this under conditions of a labor shortage, right? So it's this unique situation where they just passed the CHIPS Act to make semiconductors here. A lot of it is going to be done down in Boise. That's great. We want to bring semiconductor manufacturing back here, have indigenous computer manufacturing, but the unemployment rate in Boise is 2.5%. So the question becomes, how do you staff a new semiconductor plant under conditions like that? It drives wages up and it drives prices up. So the big picture is this transition out of the economic model that we enjoyed for really 30 years or so, from 1990 to COVID. Essentially, COVID marked the end of this economic era. It was an economic era that was going to end anyway due to the demographics. COVID emphatically pushed us over the line. So we're now entering a new era where demographics and trade flows and globalization are limited. There's higher costs, perennial labor shortages, but America is still poised to capitalize on this and do better in this new era than any of our competitors, because we've got the industry, we've got the energy, we've got the demographics, and thankfully we grow all our own food, right? So I don't want to say that the 1990s and early 2000s were the best economic years of our lives, but they were certainly the lowest cost, right? And so we need to understand that we have transitioned emphatically into a new economic environment and plan accordingly. So with that, I would love to take questions. I'm sure there are some in the chat.
Yeah, I've been kind of paying attention to the chat here. I've got several questions coming through. So the first one, Sam, is when considering your example about China and their pork and fertilizers, do you see the economy moving away from a global economy and more towards protectionism, with countries working to become more self-sufficient?
I think that protectionism, yes, but not total self-sufficiency. The drift seems to be towards regional trading blocks. So I would expect that in the future, America is going to have substantial trade with Mexico, with Canada, with some of the South American countries, with the countries that are in our the circle of trust, right? The UK is economically dependent on us anyway. So instead of global trading, you're going to see block trading. And you're already starting to see this with Iran and China and Russia solidifying some of their trade flows. So you're going to see a global trading system splinter into not maybe direct competing, but certainly regionalized trading groups.
Perfect. Other question, in the demand destruction threshold, is there also, is the demand, I'm sorry, let me make sure I'm understanding this question. Is the demand destruction threshold also different for different products, similar to how inflation is not the same for TVs as they are for gas and groceries?
Yes, of course. Households will always prioritize. They're always going to have to purchase food and energy, but those luxury purchases are going to begin to trail off, and you'll see overall demand destruction, even if, I mean, it's very hard to, unless you're going on a diet, right? Food demand is pretty constant, right? So certain categories are more vulnerable to inflation than others. There's actually been a lot of research on this, and somewhat intuitively, you could probably guess coffee seems to be one of the most robust and durable categories in the face of inflation. So that's one of the last things that people cut out, but they will prioritize, of course.
With the global population on decline, won't everything even out eventually? Less population, less demand on manufacturing services, et cetera?
So that is true in theory. The issue is that you're going to have older populations that still consume things but are not working. So eventually the population will decline, but for now what's happening is it's a disparity between the working and the retired population. So you have fewer workers per what we call it the dependency ratio. How many kids and retirees are there per worker, right? And so that is shifting in an unfavorable way. As American boomers especially still consume a lot after they retire.
Perfect. Sam, we are at 12 o'clock. I have a few more questions. I just want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. If you have just a few more minutes to stick around with us for some more Q&A.
Yeah, I'll answer all the questions, but I'm not offended if people have to leave.
Perfect. And just to answer the question too, following today's presentation, we will be sending out a copy of the recording as well as your SHRM CE credits. Sam, will this slide deck be available as well, or just in the recording?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Everything in here is publicly available, public domain data. So
fantastic. Excellent. All right, so let's go ahead. Next question is that if European countries relocate their manufacturing to the US, do you anticipate them moving their labor over also, or will we find ourselves also competing for labor with them?
you may see some more immigration from Europe. There is a lot of retirement taking place in Europe, though. So the energy issue has forced kind of a decision that was going to have to be made based on the demographics anyway. So you could see some immigration from Europe. We actually really do not get a ton of immigration from Europe on the whole. So it's possible that will change.
Is there anything that we can do to stabilize the economy so that the next 30 years are not economic suffering for all in the United States?
Yeah, I don't see economic suffering on the in the cards for America. I see a lot of growth that prices will be high, but there will be a lot of growth because kind of you're going to see a reversal of the outsourcing that we had through the 90s and early 2000s. People are trying to build inventories. They're trying to bring their production back home. I think you're going to see a lot of manufacturing growth, and you're going to see a lot of innovation in the manufacturing sphere with additive manufacturing, and 3D printing is a category of additive manufacturing. So I think that, frankly, I think America's economic future is very exciting. It is the grind of the transition that will be painful for some people. and it is going to result in higher prices. But America, I think, is one of the countries that you can look at and say there's a lot of potential for dynamism and growth. And ultimately, what that hinges on is that we have a huge internal market. So when the Japanese, I'll give you an example. Japan can't really make cars anymore like they used to because of their demographics. So they had to outsource. Japan outsourced production of Toyotas and Hondas and such. They kept the design and engineering in Japan, but they had to outsource a lot of the manufacturing. And they said, well, where are we going to make it? Well, duh, we're going to make it in America because that's where the most consumers are, right? So we've got the consumers. We have a very strong, very valuable currency. With everything that's going on, the American dollar is performing phenomenally. We have cheap energy. We have, unlike China, we have good soil. We have a very productive agricultural system. So America has the opportunity for really dynamic growth, but growth comes with inflation and turnover and change. So it's the question of going through this transition that will be painful. But I don't see economic collapse for America, not at all, not like you might see in Europe or Russia or other places.
All right, I just have a handful of questions left. Do you anticipate a labor crisis in the future for Ukraine, given the death toll of younger men in the current war against Russia?
So Ukraine is, here's the thing about Ukraine. You don't want to speak badly of them because of what's happening to them, right? But Ukraine was not in a good place before Russia invaded. Ukraine had the highest percentage of citizens working in other countries of any country in Europe. Ukraine also had the lowest per capita GDP of any former Soviet country. So Ukraine's economy was not in a great place anyway. And I fear, not to be blunt, but even if Ukraine succeeds militarily, it is kind of turned into a failed state because so much of their infrastructure has been destroyed. A lot of their population left, and I suspect they won't go back because already something like 10% of the Ukrainian population was working in other countries because Ukraine's economy just was not, it did not have a robust economy to begin with. So it was already fragile, and now it's been, abused. So I don't see a very bright future for them, sadly. And you feel weird, saying that because of what they're going through right now. But we can read the GDP figures, and it just wasn't good to begin with.
That's a good perspective to have. Is even before wasn't looking pretty.
No.
I'm going to do 2 more questions and then we'll close it out. There has been a lot of stock market volatility this year, and do you feel that is directly tied to the items you covered today, something different, or a combination of many things?
It's tied to a lot. So there's a lot going on there. Some of it is that a lot of companies have been trimming their bull market fat. So you started to see some corporate layoffs, and that kind of reflects that the stock market was probably overvalued just as a result of all the liquidity sloshing around. So my favorite example is Nikola Motors, not Tesla, Nikola Motors, which at one point it had a valuation of $500 billion or something. They didn't even have a prototype. They had like a drawing of an electric truck, and it was worth $500 billion. And now it's worth nothing. But the reason it was worth so much was because there was so much money just kind of sloshing around the bucket trying to find value. That's sort of subsiding. So some of it is just high tide receding. A lot of it is due to inflation, people pivoting to safer assets. Part of it is rising interest rates make other financial investments attractive. So there's a lot going on there. But it really just reflects that you had a market that was at a high point valuation, and it's being dragged down by inflation and the rising interest rates and people trying to figure out how to safely deal with their money. The other thing to remember is that when people retire, they tend to move money out of riskier assets like stocks and into safer things like bonds, right? You're trying to make money, grow it, and then once you retire, you want to move it to something safer. So that's partially what's behind the drawdown as well.
All right, last question here for you, Sam. You briefly mentioned the Gen Z mental health concerns. Do you see the disability of despair workers increasing as Gen Z continues to enter the labor force? And if so, how can employers get ahead of that?
Yeah, so that would be a different category. Disabilities of despair is heavily tied to substance abuse. Gen Z has issues with very, very high anxiety rates, eating disorders, things of that nature. A lot of it sadly seems to be social media induced from the best we can tell. Yeah, Gen Z's, I mean, the health statistics are truly alarming. It's something like 40% of high school girls have report an eating disorder or like a body image disorder. Their anxiety rates are the highest of any generation, which is insane because they don't actually have real problems yet. So it's actually crazy that college students have sky high depression rates because theoretically that's supposed to be the happiest time of your life, theoretically. So I wouldn't categorize that as the same thing as the disabilities of despair, but I do worry about their ability to be as productive as other generations. Like the rates of SSRI prescriptions are just astronomical for young people right now. So I worry about their ability to be as productive as past generations have been.
And what
But
do
I
you
would,
think? Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
As far as what can employers do to get ahead of that, as far as from a labor workforce perspective?
I don't really know what you can do to get ahead of it other than to just be aware that, I mean, if you're interviewing someone 18 to 30, sadly, there is, there's something like a 45% chance that they have either diagnosed anxiety or depression. And obviously, you can't discriminate against someone, but I don't know what the impact on their productivity will be, but I can't imagine that it's positively correlated. I can't imagine anxiety is positively correlated with productivity. So, you have to adjust to the population that you have. And ultimately, that's what all this is about, is making the most of the population you have, maximizing a bad situation, as you will.
Yeah, I feel like as business owners and HR professionals, that's a lot of what we do is take the cards that you're dealt and make the best of it. So
Absolutely.
awesome. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing these valuable insights. Might swap some of my fantasy football team around to have some more Bills folks. So thanks for the hot tip. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's presentation. Just as a reminder, again, following the presentation, you will receive a follow-up copy with the recording, the slide deck, and your SHRM CE credits. We hope you found today's presentation valuable. Please make sure that you are subscribed to our email notification so you can receive notifications of future webinars. And thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much, Sam. This is great. And I will catch you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.